Getting HTML into Notion used to be a pain in the ass, but I've solved it. Here's how. We had a similar situation before. So you're generating an HTML file as part of brainstorming or whatever, just a nice diagram. But then how do you get that actually into Notion or make it useful outside of Claude, for example? And there's a couple ways to do this, but I found one that was quite a pain in the ass to set up. That's why I want to show it to you how it works, so you can do it yourself as well. But it ultimately, I think, is much better than, for example, rendering a screenshot of the HTML page, because then we lose all the interactivity, right? So that kind of is the pro of having an HTML directly embedded in Notion. And there's a couple problems here. So the Notion connector that it comes with Claude, or you can easily install, doesn't support adding raw blocks. So one challenge, for example, is that you need to set up the Notion API MCP, which is essentially slightly different to the built-in one. Somewhat simple to set up. It's all in here. I'll drop that link below so you can do it yourself, but ultimately you can add it to your desktop config, and then you have to restart Claude, and then you will be able to use it. It will show up here in connectors. So this is the normal one, but then you have the Notion API one here. So this is the one that I was using, because with the other one you can just write whole pages and do very limited operations, and the API one is much more flexible. But how does it work from like a workflow standpoint? So essentially we have a local HTML file. This can be, just on your computer, or it can be, Claude will often generate, if it doesn't generate like docs, it will generate HTML files for visualizations. It's not that good at SVGs either, I have found, unless it's a very simple one. That's why HTML is just much more flexible. And then what I'm doing is essentially I upload it to Vercel Blob, which is, just a bucket storage. You can use S3, you can use something else. It's just by far the simplest, I think, to set up and use. And I've already have it for my kind of internal project. And then what I'm doing is I'm prepending HTML preview.github.io. So essentially just a way to, preview the HTML, because if you save it into Blob, it will give it to you. Yeah, it will give it to you as a raw HTML file, which if you're trying to render it within Notion, it will just not work. Like it will just have this infinite loader here. But if you prefix it with HTML preview, essentially wraps it in the HTML preview, that knows how to handle the raw HTML to show it, and then that you can embed as a link. So you can see here, this is the non-wrapped embed, and this is just a test page, right? So this doesn't really matter what's on here, but this is now how I want to see it in the embed, and obviously I don't want fucking loader to show it. And now what we can do is that. Let's try it out live. Once it's wrapped, you can use these hatch block children, whatever. So the Notion MCP will know how to do it. You just have to tell it, like, now embed that on this Notion page, essentially. And this is a way for me to then not just transfer the text of a markdown that I generate here. So my process usually generate a markdown file, iterate the markdown file until I'm happy with how it looks. And then I transfer it to Notion, because the local iterations are much faster. Because it's just on my file system. It doesn't have to use the MCP. So it's just on my file system. It's much faster. And once it's polished, I'll push it up. And sometimes I don't even push the files up. So I have local files that aren't in Notion, because the team doesn't need to see all the fucking crap that comes out of my brain. And so, yeah, that's usually how I do it. I can make like a separate video on this workflow. If that sounds interesting, just let me know in the comments. But for now, let's focus again on this, and let's try it out. Make a visualization. HTML. Just to make that right. So now basically ask me a couple questions. Stack layers, what's the angle for the visualization? How interactive? So this is, the main benefit, I would say, over SVG or what I was saying, images. For now, just the HTML file. Like, I was smart enough to recommend to also do the embed, because I've been kind of doing it here within the conversation. So I've created the kind of workflow within this conversation. But obviously it wouldn't know that in a new one. Is there like a visualization of how I wanted it? But for now, this is whatever. So now we're gonna say, okay, now. So you can either do this as a skill, right? That's one way to make it reusable. I have this internal tool where I can just save system prompts, workflows, whatever. And it's just via MCP fetches them when I need them. I just need to know the key. So it is quite similar to how skills work. And then I have one skill that's called Autopilot, which is essentially just knows where to look in that database. So whenever it reasons that it might be useful to use a skill, instead it uses that Autopilot, and Autopilot just does a routing to all those different commands that I have so that I don't have to inject as much into the context. Let's see. Now we're going to push it to Notion. Again, should be smart enough to figure that out. I think I called it something embed to Notion or something. That is my name for the command. And then under the hood, it just also uses different commands to upload to Vercel and whatnot. If you want to get those commands, just let me know. I'm happy to provide them. I just have to strip some envars and shit like that. This was uploading to Vercel. This is the create page, and now we have the block children. It should look fine. All right, so it's here. It works for us to make it like wider, like as far as I understand, which is a bit of a pain in the ass, but that can be our job, the last remaining human job, to lay out Notion embeds. But anyway, so you can see, I mean, maybe it's too much interactivity actually for an embed. Yeah, something you can play around with. The original here. Well, is to just load the HTML itself. Yeah, so just downloads the file, right? It doesn't show a preview. So that's why you need this thing. Anyway, if that stuff sounds interesting to you, feel free to subscribe below, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.